It's yet another hot day. 27 degrees for the forecast, so that's got to be 7 to 10 days on the trot consecutively of high 20, low 30s. It's been a hot job, this one. And then next week, Monday and Tuesday, is forecast for 37 and 38 degrees in this area. We may even break the UK record. I'm not looking forward to working in that. On the way to driving to work this morning to continue laying rock for the pond, and what should fly through my window as I'm driving at 50 odd miles an hour? A lovely dragonfly. Can you believe it? So I've now currently got a dragonfly sitting on the lap of my shorts, obviously attracted to a pond fan. I'll let you out in a little while, fella. I think you need to chill out a little bit. Bye-bye. Woohoo! Can you believe it? It's Monday morning. This was Friday's efforts of building. Nice to put some stone down in the pond. And what's nice about this job is actually to see the stonework integrating and tying in with the gravel around the edge rather than just border soil or grass. I think that works really nicely. Today's forecast to be the hottest day of the year so far, with temperatures in this area possibly up into the high 30s or maybe even 40 degrees. It's just gone 9 in the morning and it's already 27, 28 degrees. It feels blooming hot. I'm grateful that I'm going to be wading around in here. I don't think I'll get the camera out much today. My GoPro's prone to overheating, my phone's overheating. We'll get the gazebo up. If you can hear me over the noise of Dave, he's just knocking up some cement. That's going to go off very quickly in these temperatures as well. So we've got to make sure we're just knocking up small amounts we can work with and get it used up quickly. I just need to work through today really and crack on. Dave looking like he's off to a rave somewhere. You all right, Dave? Which festival are you going to?
Festival, yeah.
Well, good morning again. And yet another ridiculously hot day. It's just gone 9 o'clock and the temperatures are already 30 degrees. Again, unfortunately, in these heats, I really can't get the camera out very much and do the long time lapses that I'd normally do when I'm building this. So there's not an awful lot of filming going on, I'm afraid, with the actual construction of this job. But another day's progress, a load more stone put in. Hopefully today, it would be nice to think we can get this section finished off. Up until now, all of this stone that's been built, of course, we've had edging stones. I've just discovered my waders have got a leak. Oh no, Dave, my waders are leaking. I should be cool. So anyway, up until now, all of the stonework that's gone in have had surface edging stones that I've been sort of consciously looking for to create that nice visible edge. But from here round to the cascade, this area now is going to be essentially walling and then capped off with the curved paving slabs that were here originally. So hopefully I'll be able to speed up the building of this section. It won't take quite so long because I'm not going to be looking for these sort of fancy pieces of stone on top. And then we can start to focus on building the planting retainers and getting those marginal zones completed. It's flipping hot. In the shade, let's have a look and see with my Garmin Fenix watch. 36 degrees in the shade. It's been hovering between 36 and 37 degrees in the shade. There we go. It's 12:30. It's only going to get hotter, I'm sure, later on this afternoon. So it is officially too hot for building ponds, I have to say. We're being well looked after though. Thank you, Chris and Tom, for all the lovely ice cold water. We've got this lovely bucket of cold water here, which I keep dipping my hat in. This is very, very pleasant. Even if I do look a bit daft, it's very nice. So, we've completed most of the internal walling on the back of this section, and we've been able to dry lay the slabs just so I can make sure that I'm maintaining the correct curve inside the pond here. And then we can go back, lift these, get the walling up to its correct level, and then start to dig out the back here for some foundation for this slab laying. And I'm just getting up to the cascade here, so I've got to start thinking about the overlays of the pond liner and laying down the spill stone. but despite the heat, it's all coming along nicely. Making fantastic progress today. We are now at the stage where we're tinkering around with the spill stone. Now we have changed and altered it. Originally there were a couple of these original sort of Horsham stone slates that were sort of butted together to create a bit of a spill. To be honest, you couldn't really see water pouring into the pond anyway. All of the plant growth, all the Hatinia that was here and the bog bean that was over here, plus the grid was just kind of encroaching on this. So you never really got a good impression and a good view of the final pour into the pond. So that's something that's being amended. A much nicer stone here as a spill. And now we've got this in position, I'm working out the all-important levels. Now obviously, I haven't got the luxury of starting from the base of the pond, kind of gauging an idea of how deep I want the pond to be and then working my way back from there. I've got to work with the levels that are already here for these cascades, and what I can't do is play around with the position and the height of this spill stone too much, because that's going to dictate how much or how little of a spill and a pour we have on the next stone up here. Obviously the higher this is, the less of a spill we get up there. So based on that, this approximate position here is going to give us about the same as the original pour. I think that's absolutely perfect. It means this area here is going to retain water and act as a little pool. We're still going to have at least the depth of this level, 2 or 3 inches of a pour on that spill, which is basically what it was originally. And then from here I can work out an approximate water depth, and if I kind of base it on this stone here, it means we've got enough water over the marginal zones. In fact, we can go a little bit higher. We've got enough depth of water over the marginal zones to be able to get a retaining wall in and have a couple of inches of water above it. So I think that position is going to be absolutely perfect. And then the head scratching part is, for me, trying to get these edging stones into position. These are always, I think, the most important stones when you're looking at a cascade, because it's this bit that your eyes are drawn to, the water pouring into the pond and the edging stones either side of it. And I think I'm happy with this approximate layout. The edge of the stone at the back follows the curve of the stone walling here, and the inside edge follows nicely the inner curve of this section. And then we've got a nice sort of sweeping curve that then butts up to the original line of the cascade here and here. And then once this is planted up and the stonework's weathered a little bit, that's going to work nicely. There's enough of an overlap on the original cascade lining and the pond lining, which is coming up underneath, to ensure that there's not going to be any leaks from that join. So that's perfect. And there's just enough pond liner at the backs here to make sure that the edging of the liner is sufficiently high that all the water is channeled into the pond and not lost over the sides. So the next stage, I don't want to lose this sort of format or position of stones. I've taken a picture, but it's never the same. I'm just going to move the rock work slightly to the outer edge and get the spill stone rendered into place first, and then bring these back over. Really important to make sure that the spill stone itself is level horizontally. Oh, look at that, completely fluky, it's bang on, so that's perfect. And because it's a nice flat stone, I know that the water's going to pour over that nicely. I don't need to make any adjustments for any kind of riven edges or potential areas where the water might flow differently. Just keeping it level is going to work. And then from front to back, making sure that it's either level or ever so slightly dipped down towards the pond. Well, for me, that's a little bit too much of an incline. I'll probably end up lifting the front edge of this spill stone another 10 mil or so. But I think that's going to work nicely. So, we'll get it in.
You're not recording.
I am recording. Why are you shaking your glass around like that?
Get rid of the ice cube.
Hey?
Get rid of the ice cube.
You don't like them? You should
Yeah, hold on to melt in the water before I drink it.
put them in your hat.
No, that's wet enough.
What's on the hat there? What does it say?
Razor Roofing.
Razor Roofing. Let's have a look at Razor Roofing. To all my Australian viewers, Razor Roofing. Roofing company in Australia. Whereabouts?
In Echuca.
In Echuca, which is near Melbourne. Great company. Ray from Razor Roofing, hello if you're watching. So we're just giving the cascade its first dummy run, and I want to make sure that the water is channeling where it's supposed to before we finalise the cascade and start to cement and render in all of the stonework either side. If I was building both pond and cascade from scratch myself, I would have ensured that the cascade liner came right the way down into the pond and there was a great big overlap. But of course, because I'm restoring this and relining the pond and not the cascade, which had been done fairly recently in the last 2 or 3 years, I was working with a much smaller overlap of pond liner. And where I would normally do, and if you've seen any of my videos, you will have seen them, a particular fold which channels the water this way and prevents water migrating from the sides, I've not been able to do that here. So I'm relying solely on the mortar creating a good dam, channeling water this way, and that anything that does percolate through works its way down through the rocks within the main pond lining. But I need to make sure that nothing's going to start gathering and pooling either side here, because if it does, I've got to ensure that I've got drainage. And thankfully, it's been running for about half an hour. Nothing at all is working its way down the sides. I'm happy that the main pond lining and the cascade lining is significantly higher than the spill at either side here and here. So that's always very important. It looks like the wildlife in here are pleased this is switched back on. I've just discovered a newt. There he is. Or she, I should say. Oh. A little female smooth newt. Very grateful for the water, I'm sure. In you go. So, next stage now is we're going to start to build these retaining collars of stone for the planting areas and get those done. And then we can come out of the pond and start to fix all the edging slabs. So, building up the collars of stone for these marginal zones, we've got still a reasonable supply of rock here, but all of this sort of stuff is far too big for me to do my nice little walling within these small marginal zones. So we're going to end up cutting a lot of this stone to be able to use it. Now what I'm looking for, if I've got any small pieces that are naturally the right size, well, let's go with one of these. I want to be able to follow the curves that run round rather than using straight pieces. And I want them all of a sort of a reasonable, similar thickness. So a little bit like bricklaying, I'll be able to lay a collar of stone quite uniformly and quite neatly without any sort of jaggedy bits and pieces at the back, and having a nice flow along the front that follows that contour of the shelf. But in the process of cutting the stones, of course, if we cut down from the top here, we're going to end up with a very, very straight, smooth cut edge, which is really obvious and is not going to look particularly natural or in keeping with the rest of the stonework within the pond. So instead what we'll do is we'll find sections of stone that I think are going to be useful to create this wall. We'll mark up the section of stone that I want to retain and keep, and then we will cut it on the reverse and not all the way through. We'll end up cutting about 50% through the stone, and then the final bit can just be broken away with a mallet and a chisel. And that means that when we write the stone the correct way round, the top section, the top visible face of rock which is going to be seen, is still going to have that kind of natural riven guillotined edge rather than a very, very smooth cut edge from a disc cutter. So we can use a lot of this, cut ourselves a few blocks and bricks, and we should have enough to be able to get these sections built. So Dave's on the disc cutter. So my fabulous assistant has done a great job of chopping up this rock for me. So this is a good example of why you'd only want to cut the rock halfway through. So this is the reverse side of the stone, and this is obviously the face that's been cut through by the disc cutter. And you can see, compared to the natural riven face of the rock which is visible and on show, that cut edge and the corners it presents just look very, very false and artificial and not at all in keeping with that. But if we turn it over to the side that is going to be visible, because we've only cut through halfway through the rock and then broken the rest of it through, we've created this snap joint, this kind of guillotine joint here, where the visible surface section looks a lot more natural and a lot more riven in keeping with the front section. Now when this is mortared into place, this is the bit that's visible at the front, and the top of the stone is going to be visible, as the back of the retainer, as the back of the wall, but all of this stuff down here, that's going to be concealed with mortar and with gravel in the planting zone. So these are the only two visible faces, and obviously the top of the stone itself. So suddenly that becomes a very useful, usable piece of material. And if it hasn't broken away quite as cleanly as you want, using a scutch hammer, a rock hammer like this, a flat-ended mallet, you can fettle the stone and go around and just give it a little knock, breaking it up, creating a few more kind of riven surfaces, knocking away those sharp angular corners, and shape it to how you see fit. Now a lot of these pieces are very long, so what I'll then do is go around and break some up, so that I can then use a mixture of sizes. I shall probably try and split some of this as well, so that we've got some thinner pieces. Much easier to split it when it's already been chopped. So now suddenly we've got a mixture of gauges and of lengths to create a nice wall here for the marginal zones. Good morning, another day, another coffee. I'm absolutely beat this morning. Give me 4 days with a spade digging, not a problem. But half an hour on a football pitch with my 9-year-old, a football and a frisbee, and I'm broken. Well, we're nearing the end of this project, and we're at the stage where the pond is going to be drained and cleaned, which is always an exciting part of this. All of these planting zones today are going to get filled up with shingle. Dave's just currently in the process of cleaning out a lot of this spilled mortar and muck which has fallen in the building process. We'll get the gravel in first. That can be rinsed through because it's always quite dusty and mucky, and then all of this mucky pond water is going to get emptied out, and the plants in the garden I think are going to get a long sought after drink because it's been so dry for such a long time. Then we can get this filled up, we can get the filtration system cleaned and then operational and running, and we can let the pond start to settle and mature for a little period of time before the fish get back in the pond. So yesterday we were successful in finishing off the cascade area, the last few final rocks, and in completing the edging stones, these slabs all around the edge of the pond. And I was in half a mind as to whether or not I wanted to use them. I mean, they're concrete, I prefer to use natural stone, but these are old, weathered, aged, they've been there for a long time, and actually I think I'm very pleased that we have used them. That's worked really nicely. So with that sort of very formal edge on one side, which is a nice edging for the pond and the rest of the gravel pathway, and that flows in nicely into the cascade. I think I'd like to put a plant here between the last concrete slab and the first natural stone, just to kind of break up that area there, soften that up a little bit. But yeah, I think that works very nicely. I love seeing that walling underneath the slabs. Makes a lovely foundation for those edging or coping stones. You can just see a little bit of black hose popping out from the wall in there underneath that first slab. That is a piece of hose which is connected directly to a tap, so when you want to fill the pond up, you just turn the tap on and it will fill the pond directly from there. That was already in place and a very convenient and a good thing to do. Yay, the first bit of gravel going in. Instantly transforms this, concealing that bit of liner makes all the difference. Obviously we've got offcuts of liner down there to protect the main pond lining. Nothing's in contact with the pond liner itself that could potentially damage it. That's always very important. And making sure we've got a good depth of sort of 4 to 6 inches or so of gravel, deep enough to plant marginals into. All clean? Sorry? All clean?
There it is. Get ready for refill.
All nice and clean. This will be the last time that we see the pond fully emptied like this. I think even without water in it, it's a feature all on its own. It's lovely to see the stonework all around the edges like this. Nice to see the gravel in the pond. Just beginning to add a few little feature stones and a few cobbles that were left over. A couple of areas like this which are sort of a handy platform out of the pond for any wildlife that might inadvertently fall into the pond. It's a great place for birds to come and sit and have a drink or a bit of a bath as well. Now the pond's fully emptied like this, it gives you a good opportunity to see the creases and the folds in the pond liner and how neat they are. And once that's filled up with water and the weight of this pushes up against it, it's hardly visible at all. And everything above this point, it didn't matter how creased it was, because that's all concealed and hidden amongst the stonework and the gravel. Again, the pond itself is sloping down, so there's a shallower section and a deeper section, and the pump is down in the deepest section of the pond, well away and opposite the return, which is the cascade, the return from the filter, to ensure that we've got good circulation in the pond and the whole volume of the pond is circulated through that filtration. And having it down in the deeper section like this means that it's sitting down and picking up a lot more of the particulate matter, the detritus, which is going to settle at the bottom of the pond. There's enough hose left on here to ensure that the pump can be lifted out of the pond for maintenance, but short enough that there's not a huge coil of pipe in the pond, which is quite unsightly. The cable itself, again, making sure that there's enough flex in the pond that you can lift the pump out, and that's running through the pond and through a conduit here, so that for future additions to the pond, if we have to remove this for anything, that can be taken out of the pond easily without moving any stonework. There's a few bits of pond liner that I'd like to give a trim. Some of these cushioning bits of additional liner here are just a little bit too long, so they can get cut off. But in the meantime, we can get filling the pond. So a very important job to do now is to make sure the filtration system is cleaned before we switch it back on. There's an awful lot of silt and muck and stagnant water which has been settling here for the duration of the job, and with all that hot weather we've had, there's a lot of muck in here and it really doesn't smell very nice. When I took the lid off this, the amount of flies and mosquitoes that came out was horrible. So draining out all of the muck and the water and the silt, making sure that I get the foams cleaned off, ready to run. Now if you're not familiar with these systems, this is an Awaza Filtermatic filtration system. I'm running one on my own pond at home. It's a great system. It's a pump-fed gravity discharge unit, so it doesn't always work with every scenario. Of course, the unit itself has to be higher than pond level or higher than the level of your stream or cascade that you're draining to, because it drains via gravity. But if it does fit in with the setup of your pond and you've got space to do so, they're really, really good systems, as close to kind of an automated filter as you're going to get, short of a drum filtration system. Lots of filter media and a very efficient filtration system to boot, so highly recommended. Time for the all-important planting. The bit that really makes jobs like this. So, as I'd previously shown you earlier on in the job, when I took the plants out of the pond, we had some iris, some hatinia, some marsh marigold or cowthur, and a little bit of bog bean. And I've retained some of those bits and pieces, chopped them up into slightly more manageable and smaller usable bits, and I'm just going to plant these in the marginal zones simply by raking back some of this gravel, putting in a little clump, and then just backfilling that with the gravel to anchor it into place. As simple as that. A nice natural way of growing pond plants. Cosmetically much nicer than using plastic baskets balanced on shelves. And a very natural way for them to grow. Now I'm doing this deliberately with the gravel dry, because even though the gravel's had a bit of a rinse, as soon as I start stirring this up underwater, there's going to be clouds and clouds of mucky orange, brown, dusty water, which I don't want to mix with the nice clean pond water. So it's easier if I do it dry like this, get the plants into a position I'm happy with, and then we can continue filling the pond once these have been planted. lovely working with the sound of water behind me. Don't know if you can see the cascades running behind. Fills that spillstone nicely. There's a lovely pour, a lovely film of water over that. That's that one done. I'll get this lot planted and then I'll stand back and have a look, and if I feel like we need to make some adjustments or add a few more plants, I've got plenty of plant in reserve to do so if needs be. I've also introduced a new plant here. This is another variety of Heatinia. So that's the Heatinia cordata that was here originally with the plain green leaf, or it's got a very, very slight variegation, but it's mostly green. And this is the chameleon variant, a much, much more attractive variety. So it's nice to see the two together in contrast. Thank you, Dave, for bringing that along. Pardon? Yeah. It is nice though, isn't it? That flash of really bright, vibrant pink looks lovely. The marsh marigold, which had always been competing with the irises for years and shaded by that grid, is now going to take centre place here and get so much more light. All the plants are going to get so much more light, and that means that we can keep water lilies here as well. So I'll bring in a couple of pots of some established lily next week, and when the fish go back in the pond, we'll put a couple of lilies in as well. Doesn't take long, but what a difference that makes. Now the irises, I've trimmed back a little bit. They need to be able to establish their roots, not be too top heavy. So I'll trim these down a little bit further. And the bog bean, which if you remember was a massive foliage, I mean that was actually using the grid that was here as kind of a platform to step up and grow up on, so it was growing unnaturally large, and now it hasn't got that grid. It'll end up floating across the surface of the pond, rafting, which is what it should do naturally. But in that heat we've had, a lot of these leaves have started to crinkle up and they weren't looking very nice, so I've just de-leafed all of that. There's lots of new shoots on here, so that will green up very, very quickly, and in a couple of weeks time this is going to look like a different plant. I think some slightly taller plants here, just to kind of frame the cascade at the back here, will look nice. So where previously there was only iris down that end, there's going to be a little bit of iris over here as well. And then another flash of colour, we'll have a nice big clump of the Heatinia. And these planters, I mean, this can be allowed to just grow and send its runners through these little planting zones and fill this entirely. And the iris will be growing proud of that and growing through it. There we go, that's all done, all planted up. All the little bits of liner sticking out under the edges that I wasn't happy with have been trimmed. Got a couple of resident frogs that seem to have made their way back in very quickly, probably very grateful for a return to some water in this hot weather. So now we can get filling and get the pond fully topped up. It's a good spot for a bench. I think we can say that that's the construction over for this job. All the plants in, everything rinsed down and cleaned. I think the stone always looks lovely. It reveals all its lovely strata and colours when it's wet like this. So it's a nice time to view it. I think the pond level's just right. We've got a nice fall on that final spill, kind of mimicking the original falls in the stream. Quite a soft sound, not too noisy. Very importantly, we've gone round in a few places now that the pond is filled up to its full level to expose the pond liner and just roll it down so that that will act as kind of a natural overflow or soak away into this gravel board around here. We've still got to introduce the fish. That will get done next week, but for the time being the pond can just settle down. Any of the toxins and the muck from the cement and the stone can leach out into here, and then this can be drained down and cleaned again next week, or a partial drain and clean, and then refilled one last time before the fish go back into their new home. But I think this has given an old pond a new lease of life, and with that new pond liner it should last many more years to come. Well, it's been a little over a week since I was last here on site, and I've come back today to do the final bits and pieces. One of them is to do a partial water change on the pond, to drop the lever down a little bit to refresh the water, and the other one is to reintroduce the fish from the holding tank back into the pond. Now, this is fairly typical. You can see here that over the last week the water has greened up a little bit. There's a little bit more of a kind of a patina of algae within the pond, on the rocks and on the liner, and this is fairly typical of a new pond. There's also a lot of nutrients from the rockwork, from the mortar, the cement, and from the addition of lots of tap water that's gone into the pond, and that will create an algae explosion. And this is very normal for a new pond. I mean, it'll take really the rest of this season to establish and settle down, and during that process, blanket weed, slime algae, green water, despite the filtration and despite medication and treatments, is going to be a lot more prevalent and a bigger issue than it would do normally. And this is something that you just kind of have to grin and bear with a new pond, and this time next year the pond will be in a much better place and much clearer. But I'm going to drop the level of the pond down now to just lower than the shelf level. What's really encouraging is, well, one, the water level has remained very stable. Over the last 7 or 8 days we've lost an inch of water from evaporation only. That's fantastic, so there's no water loss from the cascade or anywhere else in the pond, and I'll make sure that that's kept topped up. But what I'm really looking for is cloudiness in the water. If there's a white cloudiness or a bluey tinge to the water, that can often be as a result of the cement, the mortar in the water. Mortar in the water, that rhymes, doesn't it? And that is something which can be highly toxic to fish, and if that was the case I'd end up having to do a complete water change and then let the pond rest for another week or two before I could introduce the fish. But that hasn't happened. I mean, really, the volume of pond compared to the small amount of cement which is in contact with the water is pretty minimal, so I wouldn't expect there to have been any issues, but it's reassuring to see that there hasn't been. Now, something else which is really important is for me to do another check on the filtration system. Again, as a result of the mortar and the rock work that's gone into the pond, it's going to have an effect of buffering the water and raising the pH, the alkalinity of the water. And as a result of this, there could be additional limescale deposits, precipitation on the quartz sleeve of limescale, which is going to obscure the UVC getting into contact with the pond and make the pond go even greener. And this is something that's going to have to be checked a little more regularly than would normally be the case. I have seen instances in ponds where a lot of cement has been used, that in the first kind of 6 months or so, limescale has formed actually on the filter media, on the open cellular foam, blocking up the open cellular structure and rendering the filter essentially useless. So again, it's really important to make sure that you pay attention to the filter and keep this clean. So I'm just going to very quickly check the quartz sleeve on this one. That's nice and clean and free of any limescale, so that's all going to be working efficiently. That can go back. So we can think about adding the fish back into the pond soon. So that's the pond partially drained and currently refilling, the filtration system checked, and very importantly that quartz sleeve checked to make sure it's clean and free of any limescale. And later on this morning I'll be adding the fish back into the pond. Now, I'm really pleased with how this job has panned out. I think the stonework looks fantastic. In this setting with the alpine sort of theme, the lovely warm muted colours of the stonework against the gravel works really nicely. So I'm very pleased with the overall effect of this job. But it didn't all go smoothly, and I feel that for the sake of transparency, you need to know the highs and the lows of jobs like this. And unfortunately on this job there was a major low, and that was a drastic loss of fish in the holding tank during the peak of the heat wave. A lot of the more sensitive fish, the rudd and that lovely big green tench, sadly died as a result of acute heat stress in the holding tank. Now this wasn't low oxygen levels. The tub itself was very well aerated and filtered. It was shaded. There was a parasol over the top of the tub and a tarp to shade the water on a daily basis. 3 or 4 bottles of ice were being added to the pond, to the tank, to try to reduce the water temperatures. But sadly, it wasn't enough to keep the water temperatures down low enough. And during the peak of the heat wave, water temperatures in that tub were in the high 20s and low 30s, which is just too much. And a large number of the fish were lost as a result, which is very sad. So the remaining stragglers are going to be added to the pond a bit later on. The pond itself is going to look a little bit sad and sorry for itself, and once it's established, I'll come back and reintroduce a few more fish just to boost the numbers again. But this is a really important thing to consider at this time of year, and during heat waves, even just during high summer temperatures, atmospheric pressure changes, thunderstorms throughout the season, these can all have drastic effects on dissolved oxygen content in ponds. And it's very important that you pay close attention to your fish during these particular weather events to prevent any problems. Now, symptoms as simple as fish acting lethargic at the surface of the pond, gasping, appearing to open and close their mouth at the surface, hanging around areas of water disturbance like cascades or fountain. These are all classic signs of low oxygen levels. And if you see this, particularly in the early hours of the morning, then you need to take pretty quick action to prevent any problems. Something as simple as spraying the surface of the pond with a hose for a few minutes each day can boost levels of oxygen. If you've got a pump, a fountain pump, a cascade pump, an air pump that's not in use, turn it on to create more surface agitation and more aeration in the pond. And if you haven't got any equipment like that, use of treatments. Awaza do something called peridox, which is primarily an algae treatment to control blanket weed and blue-green algae, but it also has an interesting side effect that it will help to boost dissolved levels of oxygen in the pond, and it can be a very effective treatment in ponds and lakes, large bodies of water, at very quickly and temporarily boosting oxygen levels in the pond. Now, if you're interested in topics like that, and it's something that all pond keepers should know at this time of year, Awaza are hosting a webinar on August the 16th between 4 and 5 p.m. and I shall put a live link to register for this webinar in the comment section below. If the live link doesn't work, just copy and paste it and add it to your local search engine and you'll get direct access to it that way. I'm going to be registering for it. I think it's going to be a very interesting webinar, and I'm sure I'll learn a thing or two. But this is open for everybody, not just people in the trade like myself, but for everybody, general public. So if you're watching this video before August the 16th and you want to register for it, then click on the link below. It's hosted by Paul Martin, the excellent Paul Martin of Awaza, who was head of technical for many years. He's a fantastic speaker, a top all-round bloke, and I'm sure we'll keep it entertaining and interesting. So if you have an interest in it, click the link below and check out the Awaza webinar. So I've just added a dose of cloverleaf blanket answer as a preventative measure to try and help prevent some of the inevitable blanket weed and hair algae which is going to grow in here. And that has the effects of this rather unsightly cloudiness in the pond, but don't worry, that will settle and clear very quickly. What it does do though is it shows up all of the debris on the surface and the leaves and bits and pieces. So I'll give that a good skim now. I'm going to add the remainder of my Awaza Duo Boost to the filtration system just to give that another kickstart. And otherwise, that's it for this job, completed. It's been an interesting job, a fun job. Definitely the challenges of access to the back garden were initially a cause for concern. I think my main worry was really dropping something in the house on the tiled floor. You know, it could have been anything, just even a hand tool, and that would have broken the tiles, let alone carrying some of the big rocks and heavy bags of sand and bits and pieces we were taking through. But it all worked out very well in the end. It's very disappointing about the fish, and as I say, later on in the season I will come back when this is established and reintroduce a few more fish to the pond. I'm going to be back later on this afternoon or tomorrow morning to add a couple of water lilies to the pond as well, and they'll have some pads up at the surface very quickly and just provide a little bit of cover for the fish that are in the pond at the moment. And that's also going to help to shade the pond and take the strain away from the UVC in the filtration system a little bit whilst the pond is maturing and re-establishing. As ever, thank you very much for watching. Really appreciate all the views, all my new subscribers this year and new viewers. Thank you very much. I'm Ed from Crystal Clear Aquatics. I'll see you in the next pond.